Welcome back to Leveraging Leadership, where we unpack the art of business leadership. I'm your host, Emily Sander, Chief of Staff turned Executive Leadership Coach. This show is all about finding your points of greatest influence and leveraging them to better serve those around you. Our guest today is Rob Giardinelli, an introvert with 16 years in the technology industry. He has attended over 2,000 business and networking events. Through his experience, he founded Event Mindset to help others make a positive impact and enjoy events without needing to be the life of the party. Rob, welcome to the show.
I'm thrilled to be here, Emily. Thank you so much for having me.
So as a fellow introvert, when I hear things like social event or networking event or conference, part of me runs for the hills. And I'm like, nope, I'm not going to that. I'm going to be sick that day. I don't think I can attend. So sorry. And that's what comes up. So you were in this corporate career where you had to go to these events at the beginning. So in the beginning, what was your reaction to these types of events?
Probably what yours was. Gosh, do I really have to do this? It's interesting. My challenge with when I was in the tech industry and went to events was I never really understood why I was at the events 98% of the time. There wasn't really like a purpose. And I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of people dread going to events is a lot of people go kind of either on the fly or they're not given information or they're not edified or they wind up being seated next to someone they shouldn't be seated next to. And it winds up being this really painful experience for them. And that was my, initial, before I met my now husband, the first decade, I attended these types of events several times a month and they were always painful, whether it was, a business meal or whether it was a conference or whatever it was. They were not, a lot of the time, they were not pleasant experiences.
Yeah, for sure. I feel you there. So how did you go from that to helping other people? I suppose you maybe helped yourself first. Like, okay, how do I kind of reset, reframe? If I'm going to go to these a couple times a month, which is a lot, how do I make these less painful or almost enjoyable experiences?
So in 2010, I met my now husband, and my husband has a very different career from what I had at the time. And he's run luxury lifestyle publications for the last 20 years or so. So his background was to go to these types of events. And he was going to the types of events that, would raise $1 million. Everyone was well dressed. There was a purpose. There was a program. Lots of money was raised. All those really good and important things. And it was kind of my first taste into a world. When I met him, I'll never forget, we were together maybe 4 weeks and he was like, get your tux ready. We got to go somewhere. So I had to go to Men's Warehouse and buy one, and get it turned around in 3 days and go out the door. I mean, so I certainly did not have the tools at the time to go about doing that. But I realized something pretty early on as an introvert is people really like to talk about themselves. And I guess because I was at an event that was equal parts business and social, because yes, you're in the business to raise money for an organization, but you're also there to socialize.
Sure.
And the combination of those two things really made me understand that an introvert was actually a strength, because a good event is like Earth. And Earth, you need the right amount of oxygen for people to survive.
Yeah.
So if you walk into a room and there's 100 introverts, there's not enough oxygen in the room. And if you've got, a beautiful plant, that beautiful plant does not have the oxygen to survive. At the same time, if you've got 100 extroverts in a room, you have too much oxygen. And we know what happens when you put too much oxygen in a compressed space. It becomes this big explosion and it winds up not being a good situation for
Anybody.
For anybody. Exactly. So, so for 5 years, I was basically still in tech and I was going to these, going and flying all over because I had regional, national, and sometimes even global roles. So I go all over the place, go to those types of things during the week and then come home, throw on a tux, and our publication's regional. So I'm Austin based. So I would go home and I'd throw on a tux, but sometimes I wouldn't even go to an event in Austin. I have to go to Dallas, or I'd have to go to Houston or San Antonio or any of these other cities. And the longer I did it, the less patience I had for professional business meals, because I just saw how badly or how poorly they were
Mm.
run. And thankfully, in that, my husband had actually asked me to write about them. So, a big part of his publications was chronicling these events. So I majored in communications in college, and I used it, for sales, not really for the written word. So it's not like I came into it with zero credentials whatsoever. I at least had a
Mm.
background in it and knew how to, construct a story. So I was writing about them from the guest point of view. So my job is to chronicle the guest experience into what makes
Oh,
a great event and why people go to this event and why it's so great and why people go to it over and over and over again. So after about 4 years, like that last year I was in tech, I would sometimes stay in different cities that night to get out of going to meals. So like if I had a meeting in New York, I take the train and go to Philadelphia or Boston and stay there overnight to get out of going to them. And then in 2015, I finally transitioned out of that. And then, once COVID hit, I think everyone kind of had their existential, what do I do now
yeah.
sort of situation. And for me, it was, what do I have that nobody else has? And I had this corporate background and then access, for over a decade at that point to kind of this world most people don't really see. But I also saw when I would go to those social events or those nonprofit events, a lot of business was transacted at them.
Yeah.
So not only was money being made, but also very valuable and important connections were being made from a business perspective and a social perspective. So what I decided to do coming out of it was, how do I help people like myself, especially because a lot of people, if you had social anxiety in 2019 and it was an 8, it was probably an 18 by, 2022. And even people I knew that were really rusty, really, really good at events were rusty coming out of
Mm.
COVID. So
Yeah.
what I wanted to do was put together a practice where I could help people overcome that anxiety, that awkwardness, and really empower them to be the best version of themselves at their events and that they could be themselves at an
Yeah.
event and really help people realize you don't have to be the life of the party to be successful at them. In fact,
Yeah.
you're needed. Yes, introverts, you're needed at parties and you're needed at social events because those extroverts need people to talk to and you can absorb the energy that they're giving. And, you know, like I think I had said earlier, I really realized about 6 months in to going to events, that secret. I didn't articulate it until probably 10 years later, but there was that whole thing of we would go to an event and sometimes we go to 2 or 3 or 4 in a night. And we would be in the car going from one place to another. And my husband would ask me, well, what did you learn at this event? And I'd be like, I learned this. Like I would list all these things. They'd be like, we were there 45 minutes. How did you do that?
Hmm.
And I just realized that I asked questions, I actively listened, and I engaged in eye contact. And those three things allow people to open up about themselves because people do love to talk about themselves.
Yeah.
That is a universal truth.
Okay, so you unpacked a lot there. So basically, you were going to these different types of events for a while, and you saw this huge, like, compare contrast. These tech ones are very transactional, and I try to avoid them. These kind of almost gala-like events you were describing are much more organized, have an objective, have a structure to them. And then it sounds like, you know, in a conference or a networking event, there's a lot of business being done. So there's a lot of positive connections you can make and relationships you can build. But for introverts, you have to kind of understand that you add something and there's these very tactical things that you can do in terms of like interacting with people, which I definitely want to dig into. But is that kind of recap, kind of bring us to where we are today?
That was a perfect summation of that.
Okay. So I do wanna get into that because, like, for introverts listening, and, like, literally for me, I'm interested. What were the, like, 3 or 4 things you mentioned at the very end there? So, like, eye contact and something
Oh,
else?
yeah. So eye contact, ask questions, and engage in active listening.
Okay.
Just do those three things, and you will, like, there are things that people have told me over the years that they had no business telling me, and it's, part of what I do is I don't engage in gossip. I just write objectively what happened. So I may know this information, but I'm not
Mm,
sharing this
yeah.
information broadly. So a lot of it is if people are going to volunteer that information, you also have to have that filter of what do I share with my management? What do I share with my team? And what do I keep to
Yeah.
myself? Just because it may be inappropriate, or it may be all those other things, or it may be a conflict of interest, especially if you're in like financial services or
Sure.
something
And so
like
that
that.
those pieces are like maybe in the debrief of like, hey, how did the conference go type of thing. You're censoring
Mhm.
and filtering appropriately. For someone who's like, Rob, I have to go to these events. Like I part of my job is to go to these conferences and I hate them and I'm an introvert and a room full of people is like my worst nightmare. What are some things you would say to that person to like, hey, here's how you could reframe that since you need to go to these things.
So when you have to do that, I always equate it to people entering a swimming pool. So if you're
Mm.
an so an extrovert is going to do a cannonball into the deep end.
Yeah. They're gonna flip off the diving board. Yeah.
Exactly. They may do a backflip. He knows. An introverted extrovert. And I always think of introversion and extroversion as a spectrum. So no one's really a true introvert
Sure.
or a true extrovert. They're somewhere in between. But introverts are more, I'm going to walk down the pool steps into the pool step by step and gradually get in there. And I have found that the best way to do that, because there's still to this day, there'll be rooms I go into on occasion and I don't know anybody. So what I do as an introvert is I scan. So I will scan the room. Then I will find, and what I'll find is the bar. So I'll find where all the bars are, and I'll pick the bar, or if it's a smaller event with like a buffet line, I'll pick the place that has the longest line
Oh.
and I will go there. And what I will do is I will talk to the person either in front of me or behind me. So it's a great way to get acclimated. You probably have no idea who they are. And just start with the simple, what brought you here tonight? Because everyone's got something in common because you're there.
Yeah.
And everyone got there for a reason. And engaging, all it has to be is small talk. I will tell you, for every 50 times I've done, I've probably done it a couple of hundred times. There's maybe a handful of times where I've gotten that person's contact information. A lot of it is just engaging in small talk to give yourself a little bit more confidence throughout the night. And to me, a beverage is a great anchor, whether it's got alcohol in it or it doesn't. It's a good anchor for you because, if you feel tense, you can rest it on your hand and you kind of know that's kind of your
Yeah.
tension point. There's a lot of stuff you can do with a glass to help anchor you and make you feel more comfortable.
Wow, I've never heard that one. Find the longest line and then ask what brought you here. That's very simple, but yet at almost any event you can go do that. So I love that. And then the glass piece, which is kind of like a nice accessory, and or if it has alcohol in it, it might help you calm down.
It could give you liquid courage, but if you're dry, get the mocktail, get a Diet Coke, get a tonic water with a splash of cranberry
Yeah,
juice.
I get like club soda and a lime, and it works great
Yeah.
sometimes when I'm like, I'm not gonna drink. So I love your pool analogy as well. So if like the line is like the first couple steps in the pool, is there something afterwards that you can do to like fully wade in?
That's a good question. So what I would actually do is the next thing I would do is look around and see if there's an experiential activation
Oh,
at it. And companies have really started to do this much more in the last 5 or 10 years. Do the activation because the activation is probably going to be on some level of fun. And especially even if you're an introvert, you'll find something probably a little bit fun about that. It'll make you feel a little bit better about yourself in doing that. So look for that next if after you found the bar, especially if it's right in there. And often the longest line is the bar nearest the entrance. It's one of those where I've been to enough events to know if I know a lot of people in there, I'm going nowhere near the bar in the front. I'm going to go to the one of the ones in the back because there's going to be no line and I'll have a beverage and a half before the people at the front bar even get their beverage. So, it's understanding and realizing those things.
yeah. I remember, where was I? I think it was in South Africa or Singapore, one of these places I went for work, and it was like this outdoor kind of like tiki bar, like little hut things we had, and then their event, their activity was this huge like surf wall where you could go and it would simulate surfing, but people would go on there. I did not do that, but you could go watch, and it was an easy thing to like you have your attention on something, so you're not like face to face with someone in like silence. You're like talking about, "Oh my gosh, like look at that. Oh my gosh, that was a good one." And it was just an easy way to kind of be part of something together.
Absolutely. And you can turn to the person next to you and just say, wow, that's really
Yeah.
interesting. And sometimes you don't even have to say anything. You can just kind of look at each other and kind of do that. But you're engaging,
Yes.
it's funny because, and there's been studies on this, only 8% of communication are the words you actually say.
Mhm.
So there's a lot you can say to somebody else with the other 92%.
Yeah.
And that's another way that you can kind of wade, gradually go into the pool is realize that words are only 8% of that.
Yeah.
You can do those other things by a look across a room or a look at that was interesting, and I think we've all been in those corporate events where it's like, should that really be happening? But it does, and they happen all the time. And
Yes.
you just it's I've learned to just go with it. Like I've pretty much learned to be shock proof. And part of the reason I think I do get invited back is I don't want to say I have a good poker face, but I understand that there are things that are going to be outside of my control at them. I'm going to let them happen.
Yeah.
And I found that most of the time, the only time that I really remember when something bad happens is if someone else makes a big deal about it, particularly the person that did the bad thing. If you just move on from it, most people won't remember that or keep it in their
Yeah.
brains. They'll just eventually go on with their evening.
Yeah. So if something bad happens, like be the one to kind of move the conversation or move the attention along. Um, so you kind of wade into the pool, you find the line, you got the drink in the hand. Are there any other tips in terms of like body language and how you show up and how you engage where like, okay, now I want to move to a more meaningful conversation? Are there any like tips about that where you sit down with someone and you start that part of the conversation?
Well, one, your energy has to be open. You have to show up like you want to be there.
Ah,
And it's an energy. I've gone to enough events now that I kind of know I'll walk up to somebody within 3 seconds. I'll know how open their energy
yeah,
is. And I'll be like, you know what? Lovely. I'll get out of it as quickly as possible, say, lovely to see you, and go on
yeah.
with my day. And what I would say, if you're an introvert, walk up, and it's basically kind of that same question that you asked, when you were in the long line at the bar. That's one of the reasons why you do it is you get practice with somebody else. You realize it's not so bad. And you walk up to to somebody else with that. What I would do is if there's, a cocktail table and there's someone at it by themselves, go
Mm,
up, grab a piece of food, grab, because there'll usually be some sort of buffet, even if you don't eat it or plan on eating it. You can rest it there and you can introduce yourself to that
yeah.
person. And that's another way that you can acclimate to a situation in a way that's not overwhelming, and you're not walking up to two people that are already talking, which
Yes.
that's challenging, and that's its own that's its own advanced set of five-dimensional calculus, let's just call it, to do that.
I've heard so if we go with the scenario of, like, you find the person who's, like, standing alone at the cocktail table, I've heard this tactic, and it sounded cool, and I was like, "Could I really do this in real life?" And it was you introduce yourself, and you say, like, a fun fact, basically, about yourself, because if you're like, "Hi, I'm Emily," and if you have another person who's like, "Hi, I'm Rob," "How are you?" "Good, good. How are you doing?" "Yeah, pretty good." Like, instead, they suggested, like, say, "Hi, I'm Emily. I love the Seattle Seahawks." And it's like, "Oh my gosh." Like, okay, like, "Oh, I don't like football," or, "Oh, my team is, the Broncos," or whatever. It just gets that conversation started. So, the person I was listening to was like, come up with some go-to, like, things you can just toss out there.
Absolutely, you can do that. The reason I always default to what brings you here tonight is because that's what you have in common.
Yes.
Because if you say, I love the Seattle Seahawks, and you're not a football follower,
Yeah.
the conversation's going to kind of end right there. That's kind of why I always start with the broadest question possible,
Yeah.
especially at a professional event, because you just never know what people like or don't like. And that's kind of as you have a more extended conversation, find out those things.
Yeah.
But that way you're certain to start with something that you have in common, and that is
Yeah.
whatever reason brought each of you into that space.
Yeah. And I like that one. So you use that just as your opener across the board for any in the
Generally
line, cocktail
speaking,
party.
absolutely. What brings you here is a
Yeah.
really, really good one to use. Now, if I know somebody just because I've seen them on social media, I may start with something else.
Okay.
It'll be, I saw you at XYZ, or I saw that you did
Yeah.
this, or I saw that you did that. But by and large, unless if I've never seen them before, that's always going to be my default question.
Okay, I like that a lot. So how, like, if you're an introvert and you're going into one of these things, and you're like, "It's not my cup of tea, but, I'm here, I wanna be a good guest, I wanna, like, not, like, just cross my arms and be like, 'I hate everything about this. When can I go?'" And, like, exude that energy. How can you at least go in there and say, like, "No, I was a good guest, I participated, I was there."
So one thing that you can do is find whoever the event host is.
Oh.
And that will set you 50 steps above everybody else. That's one of the things that I work with my clients on. We work on kind of an engagement strategy with the host and
Oh,
how you want to engage with them, because it shocks me how infrequently people will find an event guest or event host.
yeah.
They put in lots of work, lots of effort, and especially if you're there for one of your clients,
Mm,
you're going to stand out in a really positive way. And all with something as simple as hello, thank you for having me. It's
yeah.
wonderful to be here. And a lot of the time, what will happen is a good host will be like, well, is there anyone I can introduce you to?
Okay.
Then they will introduce you to somebody else. But you're creating that opportunity because you extended that kindness to the event host. They're going to extend it back to you if they're a good host. Now, a not good host won't do that. And there have been plenty of not good hosts that have not done that for me over the years, but a lot have. And it really allows that anxiety to slowly melt away. You can almost think of it like snow. As the temperature goes above freezing, it just slowly melts away. And if you kind of treat it that way as more of a gradual thing, those are all, what we've talked about so far, those are all gradual steps where you can make that
And
happen.
it's kind of like you have, like, a behind the scenes, like, you're talking to the host of the event, so they know kind of, like, what's what and who's who and where everything is, and it might be like, I really liked your setup over here," compliment something you like about the event, and then maybe they might tell you, like, "Yeah, we actually have this thing over here, not a lot of people are doing that yet, but there's this thing over here." It's like, "Oh, I didn't know that, let me go try that." Might be, like, a discussion point as well.
Absolutely. And the other thing that I found is a lot of the times the host will be by the entrance. So it's
Oh,
one of those things that, and if you're at an industry event and you know some of the people, but you really don't know them, one contact will turn into two, will turn into four. And there have been times where I've shown up in an event and it will take me 30 minutes to get past like the entrance, because the host will introduce me to somebody. I'll talk to them for a few minutes. And then someone else that I know will come up and say hello. And it just winds up almost feeding off of things.
yeah.
And if people see that you want to be there, people will be drawn to you. And that's something, I was never invited to any of the cool parties in high school. I threw parties where no one came. So it's not like it's something that can't be learned, but the wanting to be there and the showing up that you want to be there
Yeah.
is so incredibly important.
Yeah. So if someone's listening to that and going, "Okay, I get that," because people pick up on energy. I kind of accept that it can be a learned skill. Um, but they're like, if I were to say that to myself, it would be a lie. So if I'm like, "I'm happy to be here. This is my favorite thing to do." How do you actually like make one of these events fun for someone who historically just like I want to avoid these things. That's my first strategy is to avoid these conferences.
So you do little things to give yourself confidence. And for me, and I did not realize this until I started going to social events, I wear pocket squares now. I wear belts now. I'm not a watch wearer, but I know plenty of people that are. Wear something that says, I've got personality. And when you do
Oh.
that, you're revealing something about yourself. And there are so many, especially I can sense an introvert now, introvert to introvert, I can sense one. What I'll do is if I see that they're wearing a nice pocket square, or they have great earrings, or they've got a great watch or whatever, I'll be like, tell me where you got, like, I'll go up and my
Oh.
first thing will be like, tell me where you got this watch, or tell me where you got this Gucci pocket square, whatever it is, that, you're making that other person feel seen.
Mm.
And whether you're an introvert or not, everyone wants to be seen in some way, shape. Even if you don't want to be there, you still want to be seen. There's that little small part of you that wants to be seen. But that way you're showing
Yeah.
that you're showing who you are. You're showing that you're confident, and you're confident enough to walk up to somebody and be like, hey, I really love that. Tell me about where you got that.
Yeah. I like the question of tell me about where you got that versus I like your earrings, which is totally fine and better than nothing a lot of the times, but and I also liked all the things you mentioned are things that they chose. So it's not like I love your eyes, like, that would be a little bit awkward to say anyway,
Yeah,
but it's like that they can't change that. That was just like, my mother gave them
yeah,
to me type of thing, whereas I did choose my watch, and I did choose these earrings, and I did
yeah.
choose, all these things, so you're complimenting something they decided on, which I think is, a good way to go too. Something you mentioned earlier, which was you usually know a couple people at a networking event. And I used to go gravitate toward the people I know, which is not the point of a networking event. And it would take me like, okay, I'm going to go stand by Dave, and Dave is who I know. So I'm going to just kind of tag along with him. And then I'll kind of break out eventually. But the whole point is to meet people. Is to meet new people. So how would you encourage people to do that?
So if you're a duo, odds are another duo is going to come up and talk to the two of you.
Okay.
And when that happens, that's a good opportunity to split off. So, what usually happens, especially in a loud room, is if four of you are talking, you're going to wind up talking to one of the two people more than the other just because it's loud and you kind
Yeah.
of need to focus a little bit. Use that as the opportunity to kind of pair off a little bit. And I can't tell you, because my husband and I, yeah, we do go to a lot of things together. I can't tell you how many times over the years I have lost him through that splitting up thing. I'll turn around and be like,
Where did he
okay, I have
go?
no idea where he is. And he'll say the same with me. And I won't see him for another half hour, and that's completely fine. So, but also when you turn around and you see that they're not there, you're like, I had this whole conversation by myself. I didn't think, and that was kind of how I built confidence was I
Mm,
didn't rely on my husband. I just went and did it. And I did it by myself. He left. He saw I was having fun. He saw that I was enjoying myself enough that he didn't need to rescue me,
yeah,
quote unquote. And, it allowed the evening to continue. I was more confident. And what also often happens is that, another person may come up and
right.
it gives yourself a chance to introduce yourself to another person, even if they're meeting the other person. It allows you the ability and opportunity to just get more practice in saying hello. It's nice to meet you. What brought you here tonight?
Yeah, and as you were just talking about that, it was, I would love when someone would come up who was clearly an extrovert, like, they would just carry the conversation. I was like, "Oh, thank goodness," because now this person I can give, like, head nods and, like, a nonverbal cue, and they will just carry this whole thing, and so back to your comment about, you need an extrovert, you need an introvert. They carry both parts of a conversation, so those people will gravitate towards you, and even if you're sitting there and you're not saying too much, but you're clearly present and engaged and you're like smiling and laughing and nodding and getting it. They feed off of that as well.
They do because a lot of extroverts, if you're really engaged and they're a really interesting person. Now, there's extroverts that I can't wait to get away from,
Sure.
but there are some that are really fascinating people. And you're just like, oh my God, that is so cool. Share more, tell more. And they
Yes.
will,
Mhm.
because they want to share. And it's almost like you're holding court for them.
Mhm.
And extroverts sometimes crave that or need that or want that. And
Yeah.
you're giving that to them.
Yeah.
And you're not having to share, but you're getting information,
Yeah.
especially if you're an introvert. I actually work with companies and I actually will often ask them, who are your introverts?
Mm.
Because they're the ones I want to send to industry events because
Oh,
industry events
interesting.
are more about gathering intelligence. An introvert's going to do a much better job of that than an extrovert is.
Yeah.
And while introverts may be horrified by that, a good leader is going to realize this is a way I can develop this professional.
Mm.
Like I had lunch the other day with someone who's at a Fortune 50 company and basically said that they were a learned extrovert, meaning they're an introvert by trade, but they got development coaching and, encouragement from their leaders along the way that they became, kind of became one on TV.
I like that. I like that phrase. And yeah, and I always have to explain to people like when they hear, "Oh, you're an introvert, so you don't like people." No, 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 no. I love
Not
people.
true.
I just need to recharge by myself, and that's like a difference. So like my mother was an extrovert. She would make friends on planes and trains, in lines, at Starbucks, like whatever. She would make new friends everywhere she went, and she would get energy from interacting with people. I would love to meet new people, especially if they were interesting. I would just need to go like watch TV or read a book or go for a walk by myself afterward, but I loved meeting people.
Okay, you said the word interesting. So there's one saying that for it applies to everybody, but introverts, take note here. In order to be interesting, you have to be interested. And
Mm.
if you're interested, the extroverts will introduce you to other people because you're
Oh,
listening,
yeah.
you're engaging, you're asking questions. And if someone else comes up, an extrovert loves to connect people. So they will connect you with whoever comes up to them next.
Yeah.
And that, again, as I've talked about many times, during our time together today, it's that confidence building. And that's yet another thing of confidence that this charismatic person thinks enough of me that
Yeah.
they're going to introduce me to this other person. And, it's all those little things that you really do, when you go to those enough, and there are people here, I'm sure, that are listening that have gone to the same conference 5 or 6 or 7 times. Imagine that you went up and you were listening to that charismatic person and you got introduced to 2 or 3 different people
Mhm.
in 10 minutes. And that's happened to me many times over the years.
Yeah.
And it allows kind of your night, your evening, and it makes the time, most importantly, especially if you're an introvert, it makes the time go a lot faster.
Yes. So, if you get into that conversation where, like, they're talking and it's interesting and you got, like, an engaging one, how do you, like, tilt the conversation with, like, almost one question or comment to, you are there to gather intelligence. You are there to do some business, together or see if it would make sense to do business together. How do you kind of go from, what brought you here tonight all the way to being interested and nodding and being engaged with that extroverted person to, like, tilting the conversation to, like, tell me about this part.
So usually, like I said, people like to volunteer a lot about themselves.
Okay.
So what I did initially, and I still do it more often than I care to admit today, is someone will talk for 5 minutes. I'll remember the first thing that I really wanted to ask a question about 3, 4, 5 minutes ago that they talked about in their response. And especially if it's relevant to the intelligence that you want to gather.
Yeah.
What's the first thing that they said? Keep that question in the back of your mind, wait for a natural pause, then ask that question, and they'll be like, oh yeah, I completely glossed, and it gives them something new to talk
Yes.
about, and they'll go into detail about that specific thing.
Okay. Okay, so just hold that in the back of your head for a natural
And
pause.
then that way you're not, because introverts often struggle with, oh God, what am I going to say next?
Yeah.
That's your way of saying, I already know what I'm going to say next. So I'm just going to take in more information. I'll just remember this one thing I want to talk about. But so long as I remember that one thing, I'm going to be completely fine when they're
Yeah.
done because I know what I'm going to say next.
Yeah.
And it's going to give me more information.
I love it. Okay, last question for you. So we talked about if you have someone interesting and engaging, what happens if you don't and you're like, "I would like to exit this conversation as soon as humanly possible."
So there's lots of different ways to do that. And I actually have a lead magnet on my site called 6 Ways to Gracefully Exit Any
Yes.
Conversation, where we talk about this. What I often will do is look at your drink. If your drink is watered down or whatever, use that as the opportunity to be like, I'm going to go get I'm going to go refresh
Mm,
my drink. It was really, really nice to meet you. That's all you really have to do, because at the end of the day, if you're at a networking event in particular, you really shouldn't be talking to anybody longer than 5 to 10 minutes anyway.
ah,
So really, regardless of who you're talking to, kind of keep that in mind. Is you may be an introvert, but people are there to network. So as an introvert, that's the good a way an introvert can be a great guest, is that they're confident enough in themselves that they can end the conversation and allow that other person to network.
gotcha. Okay, so use the drink. Is there, like, one other that if someone doesn't have something in their hand to go.
If you go with a colleague, say, I've got to go find my
Ah,
colleague. It's very nice to meet you. Or, and especially if you're going, and I know at a lot of conferences, like, I was in the tech industry. So CES is a thing where you might have to go to 3 things in a night. I've got to go to my next event. It was really nice to chat with you.
yeah.
So they're all things, you don't have to lie, but those are all things that you can do. Those 3 things, you can find truth in one of the 3 of them.
Yes,
Well, in 98% of
and I
instances.
mean, even with a comment like, "I need to go check on a colleague," that could mean a myriad of different things. Like, I need to go check by text or email or just check if they're over in this direction, over here across the room. So I think that's a really good, go-to. go-to statement to say. Rob, this has been fantastic. Is there anything else that we missed that you want to make sure to get across in terms of going into these events as an introvert?
Just remember you're valued and you are really important there. So
Mm.
anyone who tells you otherwise isn't a good event host and isn't a good event guest, because you really are valued. And I went to 2,000 events, so you don't have to to learn that. So trust me when I say that you are really valued and really important. And Emily, I can't thank you enough for the time today. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was. And we'll have all the checklist and links to your information. If someone is like, oh my gosh, I need to get in touch with Rob, what is the best way for them to do that?
So go to eventmindset.com or email me at info@eventmindset.com, or find me on LinkedIn or Instagram at Rob Giardinelli. And that spelling will be in the notes, the
It
notes of
will
the
indeed. Yes.
episode.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Rob. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Emily. This was a pleasure.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.